Welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast. I'm your host, Zach Kendrick, editor of Reading for the Glory. Reading for the Glory exists to help followers of Jesus think biblically about books. For more information, please visit readingfortheglory.com.
Evangelical, interdenominational, reformational. At Beeson Divinity School, these core values are the foundation on which we prepare students for a vocation in ministry. Based in Birmingham, Alabama, our graduate degree programs are offered in person and are strengthened by faculty mentoring, small class sizes, and a vibrant community. Take the next step in preparing for ministry at Beeson Divinity School.
Today on the podcast, I am glad to be joined by Pastor Andrew Hébert. And for readers of Reading for the Glory, you may remember that we did an online print interview with Andrew back in 2022. And we're glad to have him join us today on the Reading for the Glory podcast. Andrew Hébert is the lead pastor of Mobberly Baptist Church in Longview, Texas. And he holds degrees from Criswell College and the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. You have to be sure to put the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in there. Andrew and his wife, Amy, have 4 children, Jenna, Austin, Mackenzie, and Brooklyn. He is the author of Shepherding Like Jesus, Restoring the Wild Idea That Character Matters in Ministry. That's from B&H Press. So welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Zach, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, glad to have you. In our conversation today, we're going to be discussing your new book, Shepherding Like Jesus, as well as a broader discussion on pastoral ministry, leadership, pastoral character, and that sort of thing that's come up in Christian circles as of late, not just in the Southern Baptist Convention through which you minister, but also broadly in the Christian world. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you a few questions, kind of some icebreaker questions so that our audience can get to know you a little bit better. And then we'll jump into our formal discussion. You good with that?
I'm good.
All righty. Just 1 or 2 word answers, maybe a sentence, depending on how much you want to give. But short and sweet is kind of what we're aiming for here. First question is, where did you grow up?
I was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, but my family moved to Houston, Texas when I was 2. So Houston is home.
I got you. Were your parents missionaries?
My dad worked in the oil field.
Okay.
And so we lived there for about 5 years. I was born on the tail end of that, and then we moved to Texas, which is where I grew up and lived until I went to college.
So from one oil region to the other.
That's right.
There you go. What's your favorite color?
Blue.
Is that connected to anything specific, or just you just like the color blue?
I just like the color blue. I don't know that I have a super spiritual reason for it. I just like it.
There you go. Or even a sports reason, I guess, maybe. I don't know. What's your favorite food?
Tex-Mex. Could eat it every day of the week and twice on Sunday.
That is me and my wife, too. Tex-Mex, Mexican. Yeah. We like. Do you have a favorite restaurant that you like to go to there in Longview?
Ooh, in Longview, probably the place I go to most of all is a place called Telly's Mexican, which is just kind of a local dive here in town, and it's always good.
Yeah. Here in Birmingham, where I'm at, we several years ago, the chain Chuy's came over. So
Yeah.
Are you a big fan of Chuy's?
We've got a Chuy's here in town, and we had a Chuy's not far from where I went to college. And so I probably spent a little bit too much time there. That free queso bar, is very tempting. Of course, that went away during COVID, which is one of the great tragedies of COVID.
That is right. Yeah, we were just there the other week for my wife's birthday, and yeah, they'll give you the salsas and everything, but you still have to pay for your cheese dip now, which is unfortunate. What is your favorite sport to watch?
Baseball.
And I know following you on social media, you're a huge fan of the Houston Astros. Is that correct?
Diehard Houston Astros fan. Loved them when they were terrible, and have just really enjoyed the last 8 or 9 years where they've had a resurgence and been dominant.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here with the Braves. I was a big fan of them in the 90s, and I know a few years ago they beat your Astros in the World Series, but you guys came back and won it the next year. So, and it seems like the Astros have been doing better than the Braves as of late, so that's good for you guys. What's your favorite hobby?
Honestly, I love a lot of different hobbies. So probably my most recent favorite hobby would be scuba diving.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Do you like to go like in the Gulf or where?
I've been in Cozumel a couple times, and actually learned how to scuba dive whenever I lived in West Texas, and we had a blue hole that was not far from where we lived, about 2 hours away in New Mexico, and so we could dive down to about 90 feet in a natural blue hole.
Yeah, I'm sure being underwater is peaceful, but also maybe terrifying at the same time. This is your first book, correct? Shepherding
It's
Like
my first.
Jesus.
It's my first book.
All right, so we're going to skip that next question because that is going to be your favorite book that you've ever written. The last question. So we're going to assume that the Bible is your favorite book to read. But besides the Bible, what's your favorite book to read?
Without a doubt, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, that's a good one. You're not the first one to mention Lewis or Tolkien on our podcast, so I know they are influential in the broader Christian world. So yeah, that's a good one. Well, that ends our kind of lightning round questions. So we're gonna transition here to our formal discussion. And as we begin, for the purpose of our conversation, we like to every week, as far as possible, to read a passage of Scripture just to kind of set up our conversations that we have with authors and pastors and people as we talk about books. But we would be amiss to not talk about the book. And so, since your new book centers around the Beatitudes, would you be willing to read for us the Beatitudes found in Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12?
I'd love to do that. Thank you. Thank you for the privilege. So yeah, this is Matthew 5, 1 through 12, and I'm reading out of the Christian Standard Bible. It says, when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven, for that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
Amen. I'm struck by your book subtitle, that restoring the wild idea that character matters in ministry. And in the book, you allude to the fact that, and not just allude to the fact, this the kind of the main thrust of your book, that having character is somehow a wild idea or maybe a strange idea. Unless someone looks under a rock, we see no shortage of character issues in our culture, from politicians to business leaders, celebrities, and sadly, even among many pastors. We might expect people outside of the church, especially those in church leadership, to we would expect those who are not in church leadership to maybe display. Well, let me rephrase that. We would expect from those who are in church leadership to display a good standard of moral character. Why do you think that we see a lack of character in our culture today, even among pastors?
You talking about in the culture at large or in church culture specifically?
Both, because I think there's definitely a breakdown in character in the culture at large for various reasons that we probably don't have time to dive into in this conversation, but also within the church. And then why do you think that there's a breakdown in character among some pastors?
Well, it shouldn't be surprising to us that there's a lack of character in our culture. I mean, they're living. Those who don't know Christ live out that nature. You know, Ephesians 2 says that by nature you were children of wrath, and so we should expect the world to act like the world. What we shouldn't expect is for the church to act like the world, and particularly Christian leaders to act like the world. I think that's the more troubling. You know, it doesn't trouble me at all to look around in our culture and see a godless culture acting like a godless culture. I mean, that makes sense. I don't like it. It's not good. But that's about what we should expect. I think what's really troubling to me is when we see those who claim the name of Christ acting in the same way that those in a godless society act. And so, why is that the case? I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the reasons I think is because several decades ago, I think the church at large in North America really exchanged our theological heritage for a pragmatic bowl of porridge. We adapted to the life and ministry of the church, really secular business techniques, if you will, kind of baptized a lot of secular leadership theory into the church. I think this was driven and closely connected to the seeker-sensitive movement, say in the 80s and the 90s. The church I grew up, I was born in 86, so my growing up church experience was in the 90s, and saw a lot of those seeker-sensitive kind of things begin to happen. And there was just a shift in focus towards kind of secular, pragmatic leadership practice, and a lack of focus on our theological calling, our theological heritage, on the core issues related to what it means to be a pastor as a vocation. The focus began to shift onto pastors' capabilities and competence and charisma. And so certain very charismatic, gifted speakers and leaders began to be elevated and platformed. And in the 90s and 2000s, and really the last 30 or 40 years, there kind of became this celebrity pastor phenomena. And in that process, we lost a focus on something much more basic, which has to do with who you are as a pastor. I mean, keep in mind when Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3 about the qualifications of a bishop or an overseer or a pastor, he says a bishop, an overseer, must be. That's how he begins. He must be, not must do. It's first about being who you are in your character and your integrity, your Christ-likeness. And we've just gotten away from that in the last several decades.
Yeah. I think that's true, and definitely makes sense in that regard. Do you think that you see a shift back to the more, or a shift away from that charismatic, not just seeker sensitive, but the less emphasis on the pastor's charisma and super ability and gifting, as far as like to be able to draw people in and that sort of thing. Almost a lot of times we built churches on personalities, and in a lot of ways that was not necessarily a bad thing if that person had character. But when that person didn't have the character to sustain the ministry, everything fell apart. Do you see a shift back to a more biblical understanding of the pastor and those that lead the church to less in a charismatic sense, but more in a 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1 sense?
Yeah, I don't know that I could say that I've seen that shift back to that yet. I mean, the subtitle of my book is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Returning to the wild idea that character matters in ministry. Well, it shouldn't be a wild idea. Like this should be normative. This should be the basic expectations that we have of our leaders, that they have integrity and character. But it kind of has become a wild idea, right? It's become something that has not really been our focus. And I don't know that I've seen a shift back to that yet across the board. What I do see happening right now is a kind of exposing or unveiling of the lack of health in church leadership. And so whether that is, major leaders who have had a moral failure and had a very public fall from their ministry position, or if it's like the 2019 Houston Chronicle series of articles on abuse in the church. I mean, there have been a lot of things that have kind of shaken the church as a whole, kind of to the core, to unveil how unhealthy things have gotten. And so I think, and I think that's gone in a couple of different ways. In one direction, I think it's pushing people away from the church. And so you kind of see a renewed interest in deconstruction which is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, that deconstruction has been around for a long time in philosophy world, but now it's kind of become very popular, and lots of millennials are, quote unquote, deconstructing and then deconverting. So they're reacting sometimes, I think, to what they're seeing in the church. They see hypocrisy or toxic leaders or something like that, and they're reacting by pulling away from the church, deconstructing, deconverting. But I think the other way that you can respond to that, when things are unveiled or exposed and you see how unhealthy things are in the church or with church leaders, the other direction you can go, instead of deconstruction, how about reformation, right? And that's my prayer for the church, is that we would see a reformation, and that we would work towards renewal. And I do think there are a lot of people who desire that and are working for that. I just don't think that has happened across the board yet.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. Just thinking about in your own life and ministry, you're younger pastor. This is not your first church, Moberly Baptist, but you're fairly young in your own ministry. How does this idea of character, and even seeing the fall of others, that unveiling of the unhealth, particularly in the Southern Baptist Church, is what you were referring to from 2019 Houston Chronicle, but even from a broader Christian perspective, how do you guard against that unhealth as in your own ministry, and does that seeing what's been going on, particularly in the Southern Baptist world, keep you? How does that keep you humble in ministry and close to Christ in ministry?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I would use the phrase humble in ministry to describe myself. I think if I use that phrase, it probably would show that I'm not very humble. I do work hard to guard my heart, right? I mean, the Proverbs tell us to guard your heart. So I work hard at that. But let me just say at the beginning, Scripture makes it very clear to beware when you think you're standing, lest you fall. And so I would say, any one of us is capable of anything. I mean, the doctrine of total depravity teaches us that any one of us could, but by the grace of God, fall in temptation. And so I'm going to give you an answer to your question, but I want to start by saying, I want to make it clear that you, Zach, and me, Andrew, we are not above or beyond temptation. Yeah. And so we have to be very, very careful and very guarded and beg God to protect us. Lead us not into temptation. Like, that's what we have to pray. God, keep us from the things that our sinful hearts are drawn towards. In September, I'm entering my 20th year of ministry. So I've been doing this since I was 18. I'm 37 now. And I've been very blessed to have some godly older men in my life, pastors who have finished well and been very faithful, and who have been mentors in my life. And so they've really helped me to develop a healthy life, right? Paul tells Timothy, pay close attention to your life and your doctrine. And so we've got to pay close attention to our life. And I don't know that I always paid super close attention to my life in the earliest years of my ministry. That's really been something that has developed really more in the last decade or so, thanks to the influence of several godly mentors. But I think one of the things for me that's very important, the first and most important thing is just investing in my own walk with God and just my intimacy with Christ. I think intimacy is the greatest protection against temptation. So when I love Jesus most, I will fight sin best. When my own walk with God is close, that's the best. That kind of offense is the best defense, if you will, against a lack of integrity or sin in my life. And so I really want to do the types of things that cultivate that close walk with God. And that's not rocket science. I mean, Christians have been doing this for 2,000 years, and so we can glean a lot. But I'm talking here about, the basic spiritual rhythms of a Christian life. So daily time in God's word, daily time in prayer, daily work in memorization of Scripture and meditation on Scripture, weekly Sabbath, taking one day a week to just totally take a break and focus on the Lord, rest, cultivate, my walk with him, but also my walk with my family. Those basic spiritual disciplines, that Christians have been cultivating for a long time. All of those things help us to have an intimate walk with the Lord in pastoral ministry. So I really focus on those things. I also then focus on intimacy in the relationships that God has entrusted to me. So that's my wife, that's my children, and that's friends. And I think all three of those are really important circles of relationships for me. And again, intimacy is a defense. So I want to have a weekly time with my wife where we're investing in our marriage. I want to have time with my children every week. I want to make sure that I'm not pastoring in isolation or in loneliness. So I have a close group of friends. I've got a group that we literally text multiple times every single day, and we invest in that relationship. So all of those things are really, really important in terms of living a healthy spiritual life as a pastor.
Yeah, I think that advice is not only helpful for pastors and church leaders, but all Christians. If we're fostering those things, and I know I struggle with them personally, but if we're fostering those things, it can guard not only against temptation, but can help us to be the men and women that God has called us to be, and to fulfill the calling the Lord has on our lives, whether that be in pastoral ministry or not.
Yeah.
So I think
one
that's
of the
that's very
spiritual
helpful.
disciplines I think that I've neglected historically, that I've spent more time in the last year, that I've found to be very spiritually fruitful, is the discipline of fasting. I love to eat. I love food. I'm from Texas, and so we have great, Tex-Mex and great barbecue and stuff like that. So I love to eat. But I've been more intentional. My wife and I both have this last year to fast regularly. I mean, at multiple days every week. And that has really brought a lot of spiritual fruit in my walk with God in terms of learning self-control, right? Which is one of the fruits of the Spirit, the discipline of self-control, looking at something that I want and saying no, and practicing self-restraint and self-control by the power of God's Spirit. Well, that pays all kinds of dividends in other areas of my life, that teaches me that I don't have to be governed by the stomach, right? And I don't mean just food there. I mean the animal hunger, the appetites. Those things don't have to control me. That I can say no to that and say yes to Jesus, all in the power of the Spirit. That's been very, very spiritually beneficial. So, yeah, I would encourage anybody listening just to lean into those spiritual rhythms, those spiritual disciplines that Christians have practiced for a long time, and it is a great protection against all the temptations that face us as leaders.
Yeah, and here, the good plug for a good resource would be Donald Whitney's Spiritual Disciplines on the Christian Life. And so I think that would be helpful, especially as Baptists. We're not very keen on fasting, I know. So, but yeah, those spiritual disciplines are helpful, not only just in pastoral ministry, but for the Christian life. You've touched on this some in the conversation, but just kind of getting into your book a little bit more. Why did you believe that a book about pastoral character was needed? I know your book's a couple years old, but the topic is still very fresh in Christian culture. Why do you think a book like that was needed, not only when you wrote it, but also still today?
Well, it was really birthed out of some personal experiences that I had, but also some kind of institutional crisis that the Southern Baptist Convention was facing. I think one of the triggers for me, was personally just watching some friends in ministry have major moral failures and end up dropping out of ministry before they cross the finish line, and then some of the sort of ministry heroes that I looked up to. Well-known evangelical names. I won't mention them, but if I mention them, names that people would recognize, and just watching some of the toxic leadership patterns that caused a downfall, or sexual temptation, adulterous relationships that caused a downfall, or, greediness or dishonesty with money, some of those things that began to, these guys that you would look up to, and then it seemed as if there was a kind of a veneer of faithfulness. It seemed like they had really great ministries, and then you realize, oh, there's something lacking there, right? There's like a huge character issue that leads to a downfall. So that was just personally something that I've experienced over the last several years. Even a couple of mentors who had falls from ministry. But then the institutional crisis, I've made reference to the Houston Chronicle series on abuse in the church, which did focus on primarily Southern Baptist churches, and I pastor a Southern Baptist church, and that was, again, one of those moments of unveiling or exposing something that was problematic, and so that really got the wheels turning in my mind, and I had been ruminating and thinking about this whole issue. And then in 2020, when COVID kind of shut everything down, I started just putting thoughts on paper and really started working through the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in particular, and just applying it to the life of a pastor. Because when I see Jesus teach the Beatitudes and he's saying, this is the life of blessing, right? It looks very different than the types of things that we tend to elevate in our culture and even in our church culture. And I began to just put the dots together to think, okay, if this is the kind of character that Jesus wants to produce in us, as Christian leaders, how different does that look than what we see being celebrated in the evangelical church in America? We tend to celebrate natural talent and gifting and charisma and capacity and competence. We elevate and platform these leaders who are spectacular and impressive. Jesus describes very different character. And so I began just to write, applying each of the Beatitudes to the life of a pastor. What would it look like for a pastor to be poor in spirit? What would it look like for a pastor to be someone who mourns, or somebody who hungers and thirsts after righteousness? And so that's really what gave birth to the book.
Yeah, I think most Christians would be familiar with the Beatitudes, and you've touched on it a little bit in that previous response you just gave. But what are other specific ways that the Beatitudes apply specifically to pastors and those who are in pastoral ministry?
So I think the Beatitudes apply to every Christian, no doubt. It's in our Bible. It's for every believer. But there's a little detail at the beginning of the Beatitudes, actually the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, that I had kind of missed in prior readings of it. But I've always imagined in my mind that Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount to the crowd. But actually, if you look in the first couple of verses of Matthew 5, it says when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to teach them, saying. So I think the actual more accurate picture is that Jesus is withdrawing from the crowd, actually. This is not a sermon to the crowd. It's a sermon to his core group of 12 disciples. And so what that means is, if that's the case, that Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount to 12 rather than to, say, 5,000, then if we have anything close to a leadership sermon in the Bible, it's the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, this is the sermon that's being preached to the 12 men who are going to lead the early church. So that should catch our interest as pastors. Okay, if Jesus is preaching, right, this is the largest stretch of teaching that we have in one place from Jesus. If this is what he is giving to his disciples before they are going to lead the early church, then what are the kinds of things that Jesus is teaching about, right? Well, we would expect Jesus to talk about church growth. Hey guys, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to die and rise and ascend, and you guys are going to lead the church in Jerusalem and then beyond Jerusalem. And here's how you draw a crowd. Here's how you disciple them. Here's a good discipleship strategy. Here's some Wednesday night ministry programming that really will do well. Or you might expect for him to teach about how to preach. Okay, guys, here's how you're going to exegete this text, and here's how to develop a 3-point sermon outline, and get a killer illustration, and here's how to give an invitation. And Jesus doesn't talk about any of those things. All the kinds of things that we would want to be put into a modern pastoral ministry handbook. Jesus doesn't talk about any of that. Instead, he talks about character, right? This is who I want you to be. The kind of person who is poor in spirit, the kind of person who mourns, the kind of person who's humble, the kind of person who's hungry for me, the kind of person who's a person of mercy, the kind of person who is pure in your motives, right? Pure in heart, the kind of person who is a peacemaker, the kind of person who's willing to be persecuted as you follow me. That's character, right? That's the opening of the Sermon on the Mount. But then he talks about things like forgiving your enemies. He talks about how to pray. He talks about the importance of sacrificial generosity. He talks about how to fast. He talks about how to not be judgmental, right? Everything he's dealing with has to do with the heart. It has to do with your character. It has to do with less to do with what you do and more to do with who you are. And everything that you do flows from that. And so that to me is the connection point to pastoral ministry. What should we really care about as leaders is the kinds of things that Jesus is talking about, not the kinds of things that we typically focus on when we talk about pastoral ministry. Not to say that those things are unimportant. It's just not the most important thing.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I think thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, and not just the Beatitudes, but talking about those 12 men that were sitting there, we're talking about, the warning of those who in our own culture who fall away, and seeing them as examples of what not to do and what not to be in ministry. I think the same warning is even there, thinking about it that way, because of those 12, one of those men fell away, and Judas Iscariot. And so I know 11 were faithful and carried the gospel to the ends of the earth, but there's that one who wasn't faithful. And so it shows that not just the Christian life, but also pastoral ministry cannot be done in our own strength, but has to be done in the strength of Christ through the Holy Spirit. So yeah, I think that's helpful. This episode is brought to you in part by Airbender LLC. For our listeners in the Birmingham, Alabama metro area, Airbender is the HVAC company to call for quality and reliable residential heating and cooling services. Airbender is a BBB accredited company that offers the complete suite of HVAC repair and installation services. To request your free estimate, call 205-603-9306 or click the link in today's show notes. Airbender LLC, keeping you comfortable in all seasons. One of my favorite parts of the book, so each chapter kind of ends with a pastoral reflection from other pastors. You've touched on this in your own ministry, in your own life, but how important is it for pastors to glean wisdom from older or even retired pastors?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. It's been one of the biggest blessings in my life. I mean, I am who I am today because of the mentors I've had. And so, I would just say to any pastor who's listening, you can't do this on your own. If you kind of strike out on your own, thinking you've got all the answers and you have what it takes, just wait. You're going to crash. It's really, really helpful to listen to wisdom from those who've gone ahead of you, to realize that there are some guys who fought the battles you're fighting and they've faced some of the challenges you face, and particularly to find faithful men who have crossed the finish line of their ministry well, and not just in their ministry, but particularly in their own walk with God and their family. It's just absolutely critical. I would say even it's foolish to try to do ministry on your own without at least a mentor, if not multiple, godly older men who can mentor you and to whom you can look for advice and prayer and help. Anytime I face something that's challenging, I know I've got a number of guys who I can put on speed dial and call them up and ask for wisdom and advice and prayer, encouragement. And in some cases, I would say, in one or two particular cases, moments in my ministry where I would say they rescued me. They saved my ministry, saved the health of my marriage. Having a mentor who was available for me was really a lifeline when I needed it.
What advice would you give to a young pastor, or even a young man in seminary, or even someone who is just exploring a call to pastoral ministry? What advice would you give them about fostering relationships with other pastors for the sake of not only cooperation but also accountability?
Yeah, I would say you just have to be intentional about it. It won't happen accidentally, so you have to do it on purpose. And there's several ways to do that. I mean, one would be if you're involved in a denomination, go to your denominational meetings, look for those older pastors who've who are a little further down the road than you are, and just introduce yourself, and if you're not part of a denomination, there are other churches in town. Can you find an older pastor in your city? Maybe somebody who's well respected, who's been a good, faithful pastor, that you could just say, "Hey, I'd love to just take you to coffee. Can I buy you coffee and have an hour of your time? I'd like to pick your brain." And just start it that way. I find that most older pastors are very eager to invest in the next generation, but most of them are not going to go around sort of forcing themselves on younger pastors to give advice, right? They're not going to come say, "Hey, I've got all this wisdom I'd like to download to you," but they're very willing to do that if you're willing to be intentional to seek that out. So I would just say find one or two or three guys that you respect, maybe locally or denominationally, offer to buy them lunch or coffee, come with good questions, and come as a learner. Don't come there to share your opinion, but just pick their brain. Start with a list of questions. Ask them if you can do it again. And usually, just pretty organically, a relationship will develop.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. One of my favorite, not just favorite, but one of the things I try to live by is be careful who your heroes are, especially those heroes who are still alive, because we don't know how their story ends. We were talking about that on our first podcast episode about the life and ministry of Timothy Keller and how he finished well and was an example to many pastors about finishing well and to Christians in general about finishing well. What cautions would you give to those young pastors or people who are exploring a call to ministry? What cautions would you give them regarding choosing a mentor?
Well, certainly you're right. If they're alive, they've technically not finished. So you need to be, guarded and careful and discerning. But I would just look for, as best you're able to tell, men who exhibit the fruit of the Spirit, men who exhibit the qualifications of an elder in 1 Timothy 3. That may not mean that these are well-known guys. So your mentor may not be the guy who is a headliner at every conference nationally. They might be just that unknown sort of faithful pastor who is plodding along, but has just done it right. I would look particularly for guys who seem like they have a healthy marriage. If you know men whose kids love them, into adulthood, guys like one of my mentors. I mean, he's just got a great friendship with his kids, and a great friendship with his wife. It's just very evident every time you're around them, even though they've been married over 40 years, they just are deeply in love, and they have a really healthy family. I admire that. I wouldn't necessarily ask him for advice on preaching. I've got other people I can talk to about preaching, but in terms of living a healthy life and loving your wife and your kids well, while also being a faithful pastor, like I've been able to ask him a lot about how he has done that and really gleaned a lot from him. So again, I'd kind of look for somebody with character, right? I'm looking for somebody who looks like Jesus, who exhibits the fruit of the Spirit. Those are the guys you want to seek out as a mentor, not necessarily the well-known, celebrity pastor.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I know your book is mainly about and geared towards focused on pastors and those who are in ministry, but just kind of bringing in our listeners who may not be in pastoral ministry. What advice would you give someone who is just an average Christian about a mentor relationship? And how to foster that? Is it similar to what you would say for a pastor, or how would it be different?
Yeah, I would say it's exactly the same. Look for godly, more mature men or women and just ask them to coffee, and what's going to happen is if you'll ask them to coffee or lunch and start picking their brain, come with a list of questions and ask them about their own walk with God. Ask them about what's been beneficial. Ask them about mistakes they've made or things that they've done that have been good and healthy for their walk with God. What you'll find is if you'll do that one or two or three or four times, you start to cultivate a friendship with a more mature believer. What's actually going to start to happen is discipleship, right? There's going to be a discipleship relationship that just sort of organically develops. You don't have to program it. You do have to be intentional about it. You have to be purposeful, but it doesn't have to be a program. It can just be spending time with older, more mature Christian friends and asking them questions and allowing them to pour out wisdom. So I would say very similar to the way a pastor would seek out a mentor.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and we find that in Titus 2 about instructions for older and younger, and how he tells older men to be temperate and dignified, sensible, sound in faith and in love, and older women likewise, so that they may instruct the younger women in sensibility to love their husbands and love their children, and also to the younger men to be sensible in all things, to show yourself to be a model of good works and purity, in doctrine and dignified. And so, yeah, I think that's helpful for not just pastors, but for all of us to seek out those that can be mentors. I know in my own life, I haven't been able to attend it as of late, but when we first joined the church we're currently members at, I joined a small group of older men that was just they're all old enough to be my father. Most of them, their kids were my age or older, and I was the youngest by like 30 or 40 years. But that was very encouraging to me in my own life, just seeking their wisdom and experiencing the Christian life with them, because they, even though the things that my own child may struggle with, or things I might struggle with in parenting might be different, parenting is still the same. And the Christian life is still the same struggles and same things, same pitfalls that we could fall into. So I think that's helpful. Not all of our listeners may be aware. You touched on the SBC sexual abuse issue. Some of our listeners may not be aware that you did serve on the sexual abuse task force in the SBC in the first year, kind of investigating that. How did writing this book prepare you to serve on that task force, and did your service impact what you put in the book?
Well, I wrote the book before I served, so it didn't affect what I put in the book. I think I would probably just maybe lean even more heavily now, having walked through what we walked through as a task force. I think that experience just showed me more clearly than ever that this is the bottom line. If you have pastors who do not meet the qualifications of an elder in their character, they should not be in a position of spiritual leadership. And so there is a tendency. I mean, we found that there's kind of a tendency among churches to be so gracious and merciful to pastors that they lower the standard of qualification for pastors. And so there's patterns sometimes where, and this is not just for Southern Baptist churches, this is just for churches in general, where you'll hear about someone having had a major moral failure and then being quote unquote restored to ministry. Well, Paul makes it unequivocally clear, that there is a high moral and ethical standard for pastors. And while it's true if a pastor has a moral failure, they can be restored in their relationship with Christ, there is a point at which they cannot and should not be restored to a position of ministry leadership. And so I think a common pattern out there is to think that the word restoration means restoration to leadership rather than restoration in redemption. But we should hold a high standard for our leaders. I mean, I would say to the church, like, hold a high standard for your leaders. If someone is disqualified, they will do great harm in that position. And that might look like abuse, sexual abuse. It might look like something else, right? It might look like dishonesty with money, or it might look like adultery, or it might look like toxic, prideful leadership. I mean, it can manifest itself in a whole lot of ways. But if somebody's not qualified to be a pastor, they shouldn't be a pastor. And so we need to hold a high standard for our leaders. The other thing I think that the church can do is to create environments in the church where pastors can be healthy. And so a lot of times the expectations that the church has for its leaders doesn't create character problems, but it sure doesn't help. We expect so much of our pastors and work them to death that oftentimes it creates an environment where pastors are more susceptible and vulnerable to temptation. So I think that's one practical thing the church can do a better job of, is creating a culture and environment where we really care about the health of our pastors.
Thinking about that and continuing on that same vein for a little bit, I know the church you pastor is a fairly large church, but most of the churches in the Southern Baptist Convention are less than 100 members, or at least 100 attendees on a given Sunday morning. And I'm not sure about the broader evangelical or just broader even Christian world on that as far as attendance and church size, but I would assume it's not too far off from that. What advice would you give to a pastor who is the pastor of a smaller church about those, not just those, you've touched on those daily rhythms and spiritual disciplines, but as far as being able to take a sabbatical or just taking regular rhythms off to be able to have somebody else come in and preach and that sort of thing. I think it's those smaller churches that feel like they maybe can't take that day off and can't have that time away. What advice do you give to pastors of those churches?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been there. So the first church I pastored had 20 people in it. The church I pastor now has over 2,000 on a Sunday morning. So, and I've pastored churches in, all in between, and so I understand the dynamics there. And it is you can feel more pressure, particularly if you're the only staff member. You're just kind of a single pastor on staff. You can feel more pressure, like I've got to be there. And what I would just encourage people to think about is, you might be able to exist like that for a little while, but you can't really live that way. You're not going to really be able to flourish as a pastor. And sometimes we think we're a little bit more indispensable or irreplaceable than we actually are. We think, oh, if I take a break for a Sunday, things are going to fall apart. No, they won't. Like, the church belongs to Jesus. The church will be fine. The church is resilient. And you will be better as a pastor for taking that day off. And the church will be better, right, for taking that day off. So a lot of this just has to do with how you disciple and communicate with your church members. You've got to tell them that you're not Jesus. And so, Zach Eswine has written a book called The Imperfect Pastor. He says that pastors face, several omni temptations, the temptation to be everywhere, to know everything, to do everything, and all very quickly. And we're all faced with that. We feel like we've got to make every single hospital visit, and we've got to know all the answers and stuff like that. Well, that's a savior complex. We've got to teach our people. I can't, as a pastor, I can't be everywhere. I cannot make every visit. I can't do everything. I don't have all the answers. And so part of that is just discipling the people to know that, like, Jesus is the chief shepherd of the church. I am human. I am limited. That means I need to have a break. I need to take a break one day every week, right? That's one of the 10 commandments. I'm being disobedient to the Lord if I don't take a break every week. I also need time off, and I will be a better pastor, and the church will be served in a much more healthy way if I will take time off, right, and observe weekly Sabbath and take my vacation and things of that nature. The other thing is, not only will I be a better pastor, but the reality is, if I don't do those things, like, I'm going to crash and burn at some point, right? My battery is going to be totally depleted. I'm going to crash and burn. I will neglect my marriage. I'll neglect my kids. And if I'm a failure at home, that I'm a failure as a pastor. Like, the church is not well served if I fail in my marriage or fail with my kids. And so I would encourage pastors to realize, if you pastor 20 people or you pastor 2,000 people, any number of people could come in and pastor your church. But your wife has one husband, your kids have one dad, and you've got one chance not to mess it up. I'm not going to sacrifice my marriage. I'm not going to sacrifice my kids on the altar of my ministry. The church will be just fine if I miss that Tuesday night meeting because I'm at my son's ball game. But I will cause irreparable harm if I neglect my kids to go to that one extra committee meeting. And so, and the thing that's in me that wants to make that committee meeting is really a desire to be a people pleaser. And I need to teach my people, like, what you're really needing is Jesus. He's all sufficient. He's omnipresent. I'm not. And so I would just teach your people that way.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I know a lot of particularly smaller churches, and even my own experience, the churches expect a lot of the pastor, and I think it's helpful for that pastor to come in and guide the church towards that, and the setting the bar for that expectations. And I think that something that could come out in the candidating process. Because if the church is saying, nope, this is how we expect you to be, and maybe that's not the church for you to be at,
That's right.
and that sort of thing. But I think one thing I would add to that, particularly thinking in my own life, as someone who has been to seminary, who has served in pastoral ministry before, but I'm not serving in pastoral ministry currently. And for those listeners out there who may be in a similar situation, or who have similar experience but aren't serving in pastoral ministry, I know this past year, I reached out through my denomination, Southern Baptist, my local association. But for those who aren't Southern Baptist, that same network in your own denomination, or even if you just have a friend that as a pastor, particularly of a smaller church. I got connected with a local pastor here who was burnt out, and I was able to give him a couple of weeks off in stepping in to preach. And so if you're someone who has that experience and has not necessarily a gift of preaching, but who has experience in preaching, and maybe that's not the calling on your life in this season to be the regular pastor or preacher at a church, but if you know someone who needs that break, to just encourage them to take that day off and step in for them, to allow them that. Maybe not an extended sabbatical, but even just that one Sunday off to be able to go away with their kids or be on vacation or whatever. So
let me toss in here, if you've got a young man who's called to ministry, if you're pastoring a smaller church and you need to be off for a Sunday, that's a great opportunity to give that next generation a rep, right? Give them a chance. Or if you have a deacon in your church, the church might be blessed to hear from a layman. And it may not be the most polished, sermon, but it'll probably bless that church. And it may give you an opportunity to sit down with that deacon or with a Sunday school teacher who could preach, or that young man, and give you a chance to pour into them and teach them how to preach, how to take a text and study it and develop it into a message. So there are resources out there. Where there's a will, there's a way. And like you said, I think you could do that as part of the candidating process. But if you've been at a church and the church really doesn't understand the need for weekly Sabbath and even an occasional sabbatical, I would just sit down and have some honest conversations with members of your church to talk about the importance of it. There's a great book called Resilient Ministry. I can't remember the author's names, but I would pick that book up, and it's got a lot of just great information on key aspects of pastoral health, and even taking a group of lay leaders through that book together and having honest conversations about it and developing some processes and practices in your church so that you can be a healthy pastor for the long haul, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think so too. And, something you mentioned there, talking about raising up the next generation. I know other churches do it, but I think about Pastor Mark Dever in Washington, D.C., at Capitol Hill Baptist, and the internship program that they have. In some ways, he's like the Nick Saban of Baptist pastors. He's churning out all these, draftees to the NFL or whatever, to full-time ministry. But I think that that's helpful. And even if the church doesn't have something that looks like that, even if it's just grabbing that next guy, who and it might be, I'm thinking of someone right now who is close to 40, but is expressed to me, a friend of mine expressed a call to ministry, and I encouraged him, reach out to your pastor, go talk to him, and he might give you opportunity to not just to preach, but to take you under his wing and that sort of thing. So I find that helpful. Kind of as we draw to close, I've got a couple questions towards the end that really aren't necessarily related to your book or pastoral ministry, or at least character in ministry, but just kind of drawing to a close, talking about those mentors and that sort of thing. Who are your favorite preachers, pastors, dead or alive, to listen to, who have served you well in getting to know them, or at least listening to them, and helping to incorporate that in your own ministry?
Yeah. In terms of preachers, I would say let's start with those who are dead first. Probably the two most key influential preachers in my own ministry would be Adrian Rogers and W.A. Criswell. W.A. Criswell, of course, pastored First Baptist Church of Dallas for over 50 years, started Criswell College, which is my alma mater. But he did something that was pretty rare in his day, and that is he preached through books of the Bible, and took him 17 years to go through from Genesis to Revelation. And so he's a little difficult to listen to. If you've never heard him, you can go to wacriswell.com, and most of his sermons are available for free there to read or to listen to, or in some cases to watch. And if you listen to him or watch him, his voice inflection, he's kind of got that old school sort of oratorical style, and it's a little bit difficult to track. But if you'll read his sermons, they are brilliant, and the language he uses is beautiful, and the way he points to Christ in the text is beautiful. So I really appreciate him. Of course, Adrian Rogers, one of the greatest of all time, pastored Bellevue Baptist Church and had a radio ministry. Adrian was really my first exposure to expository preaching. I grew up in a church that didn't do expository preaching, and so I never really knew what that looked like until I started listening to Adrian Rogers on the radio. Also listened a lot to Tony Evans, who's of course still alive, but a great Bible preacher. Guys I listen to today, I listen a lot to Mac Brunson, who's there in Birmingham, Valleydale
Yeah,
Church. He's just
Valleydale.
one of
Yeah.
the greatest preachers in the nation, I think, a great expositor. Clint Presley, who used to be at a Dauphin Way in Alabama, is now up in North Carolina. He's just a great Bible preacher, good doctrinal preacher. Stephen Lawson is one of my favorites. Just excellent. Stephen Lawson's great. Ralph Douglas West is an African-American pastor down in the Houston area, just really gifted communicator and Bible teacher. So those would be some guys who are living that I listen to often. I also go back, to older Martin Lloyd-Jones, of course, and I like to read the sermons of Spurgeon. A lot of those have really influenced my own preaching ministry. In terms of pastors, I think some of the names I've mentioned would certainly be pastoral exemplars. I very much respect Mark Dever as well. Eugene Peterson has probably helped form my philosophy of ministry more than any other individual. Working the Angles is a great book that he's written if you've never read anything from Peterson. But Working the Angles, and then he's written kind of his autobiography is called The Pastor. And it's excellent. I don't agree with everything Peterson says or everything that he was about, but I think he has a very healthy view of what a pastor is in terms of our vocation and our calling. So he's been very influential in my own thinking.
I think those are some good examples. I know many pastors, especially those that are you mentioned that are passed away, I would mention them as well. Kind of just wrapping up the conversation about your book specifically, and then I have a couple questions towards the end that are just kind of general questions. How do you hope to see the Lord use, and maybe since this book's been out for a few years, how have you seen the Lord use this book to impact those who read it?
Well, I really wanted to do two things with it. I wanted to challenge pastors, like let's the idea of developing character, that's a challenging thought, right? And so I wanted this to be a challenge to pastors. Like, let's really focus on the things that matter. But I also wanted it to be an encouragement to pastors. I hope that this book is something of a refreshing balm to pastors' souls, because I find that a lot of pastors, and I feel this way sometimes too, you'll go to a leadership conference or a pastoral ministry conference and you kind of hear about all the things you should be doing, to have that great church. And a lot of pastors walk away from those conferences incredibly discouraged because they aren't doing something right, or they never could do what that guy on the stage is doing, and they just feel like this weight, like, man, I'm not gifted that way, or I don't have those resources in that way, or I can't be that sort of charismatic leader, and so they feel burdened. And so my hope for the book was that honestly it would be something of a restful place, that as pastors would read it, they would sort of feel those burdens fall away, and to realize, like, you don't have to be charismatic to be a godly, faithful, good pastor. You don't have to have the capacity of a Fortune 500 CEO to be a faithful shepherd. What you do need, you need Jesus to be at the center of your life and your ministry. And he needs to change you from the inside out. And you need to lead from that place of character and integrity, which is, I think, in some ways more challenging and more difficult, but also it's a little bit refreshing just to know that I don't have to be like that megachurch pastor down the street. I really just need to be a shepherd who loves Jesus and begins to lead like Jesus.
Amen. Thank you for this conversation we've had about your book and the broader discussion on pastoral character. Just a couple questions as we end our full conversation with you. What are a couple of books that you would recommend? You've talked about several here, and we're going to be sure to put a link in show notes. I'm taking notes of the books you've recommended, and we're going to put them in our show notes for our listeners to be able to find. What are some other books you might recommend for a pastor to read? This could be ministry related, leadership related, or just something else that you think might be helpful for a pastor to read.
Well, certainly that book, the title is Resilient Ministry. I've just finished that one, and it's written by 3 authors. And I'm sorry, I can't remember their names right off the top of my head, but I would definitely recommend that one. The Flourishing Pastor by Tom Nelson is a must read. He deals a lot with character, which I really appreciate, but he deals with a lot of other issues as well. I would recommend his book, The Imperfect Pastor by Zach Eswine, is a must. And then I would just pick up everything you can find by Eugene Peterson on pastoral ministry. He's written multiple books on pastoral ministry. I would just buy all of his stuff and read it.
Kind of drawing in our listeners who aren't in pastoral ministry, what are a couple of books that you would recommend, as a pastor, to those who are just members of a local church to help them grow in their own personal walk with the Lord?
Well, you mentioned one of them. I mean, Donald Whitney's book on the spiritual disciplines is excellent. It's really, really good in terms of just helping you to learn how to embrace the spiritual disciplines that will help you grow. Mere Christianity, I mentioned, is probably my favorite book of all time, but that's just a great introduction to the faith. One book that I recommend pretty frequently is Prodigal God by Tim Keller, which is a story about the prodigal son, or rather the prodigal sons. But he just talks about the idea that, there's multiple ways you can be far from God. You can be far from God as an irreligious person or a religious person, the younger brother or the older brother. I think that is just a wonderful introduction to the Christian faith and what it means to be a follower of Christ. So those would be some starting points I would give to people.
Yeah, I think those are helpful. Those are excellent titles. Like I said, we'll be sure to put a link to those in our show notes so that our listeners can find them pretty readily. The last question I have for you today is, do you have any future book projects in the works?
I do, yeah. I'm actually starting on a book right now. We're getting close on a contract on it on preaching. And so it's going to be a little bit of a retrieval project in that I'm going to be reaching back to church history for a particular model. A way of approaching the text and a way of approaching Bible teaching and Bible preaching that I think is very beneficial. That's kind of gone out of vogue in the last several hundred years, but a friend of mine and I are going to co-write that. And so I expect that in the next couple of years that book will be coming out. And then I've got one in the back of my mind. I've not started writing it yet, but I'd really like to do a book on leading through crisis. COVID was a major crisis that most pastors were completely unprepared to lead through. But there's so many of those. You face a natural disaster, or you face a disease, or you face a church split. There's some kind of crisis. I really want to edit a book on and invite some leaders to the table who've led through crisis and just share wisdom that I think would be beneficial for Christian leaders today.
Yeah, we'll be looking for your book on preaching. Maybe when it comes out, we can have you back on the podcast to talk about that.
Come back.
Yeah, it'd be great. Well, thank you, Andrew, for joining us today on the Reading for the Glory podcast. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And like I said, we'll have to have you back soon.
Thanks so much, Zach.
Yeah, and thank you for listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. We'll be sure to have a link to Andrew's book, Shepherding Like Jesus, in today's show notes, and also the many books that we've discussed for our listeners to be able to find them readily. And we hope that you'll not only check out Andrew's book, but those other books we discussed as well. And we look forward to having you join us again next time on the Reading for the Glory podcast as we think biblically about books. Thank you for listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. If you enjoyed today's content, we would like to invite you to consider becoming one of our ministry partners. Our ministry partners help to support the ongoing ministry of Reading for the Glory, which allows us to produce content such as our book reviews, our study series, and this podcast. For more information, please visit readingfortheglory.com/partners. And thank you for your support.